Zelensky, to his credit, has never been conservative and has never been afraid for big moves. And his counteroffensive last year, it really didn't go anywhere. This is the first fruit that the counteroffensive has really borne at all. And it's the first time that Zelensky can say, yeah, we're not on the defensive. We're not on the back foot. We can still push this forward and take back all the things that belong to us.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Fowler, the CEO of International Intrigue and a former Australian diplomat in Beijing and Shanghai. With me, as every week, is Jacob Shapiro. He's the director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments. How are you, Jacob?
Hey, John, have you rented the Andromeda for your next pleasure yacht cruise of the North Sea, or do the Ukrainians have it for the rest of the year?
I'm in exclusive negotiations with the Ukrainians at the moment.
Sounds good.
A full show this week, despite it being the traditional August news doldrums. Just because everyone's on holidays doesn't mean there's not things that people need to know about. So we're going to talk about Ukraine still being very much inside Russia. Ask how worried we should be about an Mpox, aka Monkeypox outbreak in Africa. And can Iranian election hacking actually potentially change the result of the US election? We'll ask that question as well. And stick around till the end, because we're going to play a new game called Over Under, in which we give some hot takes that are the kind of things that'll end our careers. So stick around for that, if nothing else. But Jacob, why don't you kick us off this week?
Or begin our careers, John. There's no reason for such pessimism.
I like it, the optimism.
Yeah, I try. So last week we talked a little bit about Ukraine invading Russia, but I think both of us were a little gun shy at talking about what was going on, because you and I both know that the fog of war obscures a lot of the initial reporting, and that nothing that gets reported initially usually ends up being right. So we have more details here, and I think it's worth diving into them a little bit. The top line is that this is the first time that foreign troops have invaded Russia proper and held territory since Nazi Germany did it in World War II against the Soviet Union. So it's not very often that this happens. It's a really big deal. As many as 10,000 Ukrainian troops appear to be involved, according to a lot of Western military analysts. More than 120,000 residents in these regions in Russia have been evacuated. Super dystopian that Russia is talking about relocating some of those residents to parts of occupied Ukraine, like makes your brain want to explode right then and there. Where we are today, Ukraine claims that it holds roughly 75 towns and settlements, encompassing about 400 square miles of territory. It also says that it has over 100 Russian soldiers as prisoners of war, and has even destroyed a Russian fighter jet. The Russian Defense Ministry, it's not hiding that this was a big deal, that Ukraine was able to break through, that it's clashing 15 miles from the former Russia-Ukraine border, and Russia's trying to figure out how to push the Ukrainian forces back while the Ukrainians decide whether they want to dig in or whether they want to retreat after making their point. Let's go back and forth a bit on this, John. What do you make of Ukraine's success thus far?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton there to unpack, and I'm really interested in that last question you asked about what happens when this inevitably kind of wraps up / they get pushed back. But let me start with saying, I think last week when we talked, we weren't sure what the purpose was. We speculated a little bit, but we weren't sure. And I think there's two main thoughts now, which is the one that I don't subscribe to, which is, this is an act of desperation from Ukraine, and this is the only place they could have executed something like this because it wasn't very well defended. We've seen photos of, pretty minimally defended border crossings being decimated by a far better prepared army. I don't subscribe to that because it doesn't really strike me that they would be there for this long out of an act of desperation. And in fact, the way they executed it, speaking with military experts earlier this week, there was a lot of combined maneuvers. They used some air support. They certainly used artillery and ground troops in concert together. And that suggests that this is pretty coordinated, pretty high level of sophistication for a military operation. There was also great operational security, right? Like, no one knew about this. Even the border towns on the Ukrainian side, the residents said, we were evacuated literally as the troops were rolling past us to invade Russia. So I don't buy that this is a kind of an act of desperation of like throwing mud at the wall. What I do buy is it's kind of a Doolittle raid. And for folks who aren't World War II historians, this was in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attacks when Japan bombed the US. The president and senior military leaders were really keen to fight, to immediately strike back against Tokyo. And so Doolittle, who was a war hero, an aviation, a huge figure, a hero in aviation, launched a raid against the Japanese mainland far before America could, sustain an attack against Japan to basically try and smash the morale of the Japanese people about their government and whether the government could protect them, and to give Japanese leadership something else to think about. It was a successful raid. They bombed Tokyo, all this kind of stuff. I think that's the analogy here, right? I think the analogy here is let's give Putin, let's give Russia something else to think about. But I'm interested in how this ends, how you see this ending. Does Ukraine withdraw, or do they just let those troops get cut off and kind of, I imagine, eventually defeated?
Well, and we joked about the Andromeda and the yacht at the beginning, but I actually think the Nord Stream story also intersects with
Yeah.
why this is important, because in some ways the most important question here has always been, are the Europeans going to continue backing Ukraine until Ukraine wins or is able to carve out some kind of peace from this conflict? And you've got two things here that maybe push against that. So you've got this idea that Ukraine was behind the destruction or the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, which is something that Germany didn't like. It really set back German industry, especially energy intensive industry in general. And now you've got Ukraine going on the offensive. And you've got Western governments who gave weapons to Ukraine having to say, well, yes, the Ukrainians can use our weapons on the ground in Russia because once they went to the Ukrainian armed forces, they now belong to the Ukrainian armed forces. We support Ukraine indefinitely. So I wonder if this jeopardizes any European support, or if it galvanizes European support. If Macron says, look, we just have to give them more of the fighters and more of the artillery shells. Look at what they can do when they try and go after Russia. So I think that's a big question there in general. Look, I think let's make it very simple. There's three possibilities for Ukraine. It can try and hold this territory and de facto conquer it and try to use it in a trade and some kind of peace agreement. It can pull back to a defensible border, maybe keep a little bit of the territory to keep the moral victory, but in such a way that's not going to expose its forces in general. Or, to your point, it can just go back to the border and say, we've proven our point. We've improved the morale of Ukrainian soldiers. We've showed Europe that we are capable of striking back against Russia. We have showed Russia, hey, like, you're not just going to grind over us in eastern Ukraine and win this ball game. Like, we have things that we can do to push back against you as well. I think the smart conservative move, sitting from my comfortable chair here in New Orleans, is the last option. But Zelensky, to his credit, has never been conservative and has never been afraid for big moves. And his counteroffensive last year, it really didn't go anywhere. This is the first fruit that the counteroffensive has really borne at all. And it's the first time that Zelensky can say, yeah, we're not on the defensive. We're not on the back foot. We can still push this forward and take back all the things that belong to us. Amidst all this, they're finally getting the first deliveries of their F-16s. So maybe they felt comfortable expending this kind of material and this type of exertion with their soldiers because maybe they really are believing that finally more resources are coming to them and it's going to make them much more flexible. Because for most of this year, they weren't flexible because they were running out of ammunition and the soldiers were not happy and they were just kind of stuck in the mud. So that's kind of how I see it. What about you?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think one extra thing is that it makes it impossible for Putin to freeze this conflict in any negotiations. Right, he's not going to
Mhm.
want to go to a table now and say, okay, let's down tools and have a ceasefire, because he'd be giving away parts of Russia. And I think that means that Ukraine is a little bit more resilient to potential influence from a new American president, or anyone who's going to try and get these folks to come to the table against their will. They're going to say, okay, well, maybe we will. I mean, I don't think that Ukrainians would still want to negotiate on these terms, but it makes Putin certainly not want to negotiate. And the last thing I'll say is, like, I'm not a military expert, but it's not clear to me that Russia can kick Ukraine out like easily and quickly. It's going to involve a ton of civilian casualties to folks on their side, because we're now fighting on Russian land. If those new fighter jets materialize and become important, that air superiority over a portion of Russia is a real thing. So, I mean, I'm not saying that I expect Ukraine to be holding this, as now Ukrainian territory forevermore, but it's not clear to me that they'll just be able to kind of kick them out and say, naughty people, now we continue back to what it was, 3-4 weeks ago. I think there's a real element that Ukraine might try to bed down and hold it. But we'll see. I think what is interesting to me is the internal dynamics in Russia. And we thought this time last year that Prigozhin's run to Moscow might be the first cracks in Putin's regime. A lot of Western media is saying the same thing about it now, like, oh, look, he's so unstable. And, I once bitten, twice shy. I'm not going to say that there's going to be any material effect on Putin's regime, because I think this isn't going to be surprising to Russians. I think maybe the invasion of their territory is a little bit of a shock, but they don't like the guy anyway, or most of them kind of are begrudgingly silent about all of this, and this will just be another thing that most Russians, I think, will stay mum on.
I don't know. I don't feel comfortable enough saying that I think that that's true. And I do think it's different being the attacker versus the defender. And I mean, you are going to turn some Russians who might have just been neutral before, who say, well, okay, well, now Ukraine is attacking Russia itself. This is what the government has been warning us about the entire time. Like, I don't know that I have a finger on the pulse good enough of Russia from that point of view. But hell, I didn't think they were going to invade. So don't listen to me.
Right. Well, there's no good segue into a monkeypox, or as it's now known, Mpox outbreak in Africa. But let's crack on with it anyway. So this is the story that the World Health Organization has declared an outbreak of Mpox, and it's changed its name, I think, due to monkeypox being a fairly not the nicest name for a disease. It is quite a horrific disease, but it's declared it as a public health emergency of international concern. That's bureaucratese for one of the most serious outbreaks that is possible under WHO classifications. The details of this are still emerging, but it's the same alert that they've used before for COVID, for Ebola, and a previous Mpox surge back in 2022. So bottom line, a very serious outbreak of this disease. There are a bunch of massive unknowns. There's variants spreading. We're all familiar with the language of variants and covariants and all this kind of stuff now, but it's primarily in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's been about 1,500 deaths in Africa since January 22 of this disease. More than 14,000 cases, and 500 of those deaths have been in Congo, DRC, this year. Just to give a bit of color on it before I turn it over to you, Jacob, this is a disease that I think most people say is more like the early days of HIV than it is, say, COVID. So it appears to be spreading through sexual networks, particularly in areas of young exploited sex workers. So the problem here isn't necessarily that it's super contagious through sneezing and these kinds of things. The problem is that it's contagious in these networks where there's shame, where there's not a lot of public oversight, not a lot of public health. It's much harder to control for that reason, rather than it being as contagious as COVID was, or something like that. I was reading experts that basically said that if this disease arrived in Europe or the US, they would expect it would be pretty easily contained due to vaccinations and public health awareness. So this feels like a problem that is more about management of education, of rollouts of vaccines, of these kinds of things, more than it is like an unstoppable pandemic. But these things seem to be on the rise lately. And I don't know if that's just because we're all focused on COVID and the next pandemic coming around the corner, or whether you see this as a genuine geopolitical risk when you're advising clients to think about more.
Well, I'm not a doctor, but I did stay at an Omni in Minneapolis last night. I think we learned nothing. If the first takeaway from this for me is we have learned nothing from COVID about how to think about these things, about how to contain these things. Like, I literally want to self-immolate with the way that the discourse is around this. And John, I don't think we know the answers to the questions that you talk about, and I don't trust the experts for 1 second. The way that this story has evolved over the last 3 to 4 months makes me extremely uncomfortable, because it went from I was literally ridiculed on Twitter for saying, hey, this seems a little weird, and people going after me saying, oh, it's just sex. Like, don't worry about it. It's completely only transmitted through sex, and it's not airborne, and it's nothing else. And then the caseload goes up, and then it's going to more and more countries. And then you've got, African CDC officials saying, well, the mortality rate looks to be like 3 to 4%. And maybe in close quarters, there is some sign that it could be airborne. Like, the stories are changing and the benchmarks are changing. And it does seem like there has been some kind of new mutation. Something has happened with the strain of the virus in the DRC that is at least making it more communicable, and it's going to other places. So I think there's a lot here that we don't know. And I am absolutely banging on the table with all of my clients saying, look, there's 90% chance, 95% chance that this does not turn into the next global pandemic. But what you should have learned from COVID is, in the early stages of something like this, where we really don't have good information, you have to treat it like it's going to happen. You have to think through the implications here in general. And I don't think we're thinking through the implications. I also think that this points to to some real inequalities when it comes to Africa in particular. This is a remarkable statistic. Africa consumes nearly 25% of globally produced vaccines, but it imports 95% of them. They don't make any of these vaccines in Africa itself. And even though we have vaccines for monkeypox, by the way, it's not for monkeypox, the vaccine is for smallpox. And it
Hmm.
also protects against monkeypox. And once we throw smallpox into this, and I'm sure there are some, bio labs and bioweapons where there are still smallpox virus alive. It's not like it's completely gone from the earth. And what if this mutates in some weird way? Like that's the sort of dystopian stuff that keeps me up at night. But those vaccines aren't getting to Africa. They can't make them in Africa. They didn't get any vaccines in 2022, despite the West promising them vaccines. Europe's now promising more. Are they actually going to get them? And let's say something did break out in Europe. How long would it take for Europe to scale up the manufacture of these vaccines? Is it going to mutate again once it starts running around? All of these different, like, all of these questions
Yeah.
concern me. So I'm not the doom and gloom shock jock guy. I'm not here telling you this is the next global pandemic, but I am telling you there is enough weirdness here that yes, if you're thinking about global supply chains, all these other things, you should definitely have this at the top of your dashboard. And on the very small chance that this does turn into something bigger, I would start dusting off some of those contingency plans that you hopefully developed after COVID, because I don't think anything is quite clear here yet, at least not to the level that I am comfortable with it being.
Yeah, you make a great point initially. I in my introduction to the story, I quoted or at least paraphrased pretty liberally from experts and from virologists at universities in places like Oxford and all across the US, people who aren't in the field necessarily. I'm not saying they don't know what they're talking about, but I'm reminded of the early days of COVID when we were washing fruit and we were not going outside. We didn't know precisely how this stuff happens. And I think it's easy to bash experts and throw the baby out with the bathwater, but there's this element of they don't know, and it's kind of dangerous to project a certainty when there is none. And I think that was exactly your point, and you're absolutely right to say it. It's prepare, it's hope for the best, hope for that nothing is going to happen, but prepare for the worst. And I think a lot of countries, if they'd done that in the early days of late days of 2019, early days of 2020 before COVID, they'd be in a lot better positions right now. So you're absolutely right to point that out.
Well, and I know we're over time on this, but I just want to say, and this is why I say we've learned nothing from COVID. Um, the initial lockdowns and shutdowns, we were never going to be able to prevent the virus from spreading everywhere. And somehow the lockdowns and shutdowns led into virtue signaling, and it said something about
Mm.
your politics if you wore a mask or if you got a vaccine and all these other things. But the point of those policies was to buy the healthcare system time to get enough protective equipment in place, time to fit the hospitals for increased caseloads and quarantine facilities and things like that. Time, if you need to manufacture vaccines, at least for first responders, that you get it. It's a critical phase in trying to manage the early stages of an epidemic before it becomes a pandemic. And what you're seeing in some of these African countries, and it's not surprising because these are weak governments and weak institutions, they couldn't do it with this virus. They couldn't do the quarantine thing because nobody took it seriously, because COVID was a real failure on the part of everyone. Society, governments, experts, everybody failed in general. And I just worry that the takeaway from it is not we have to do better next time. I worry that the takeaway is, COVID wasn't such a big deal. This isn't going to be such a big deal either. Maybe it's not, but one of these days, one of these diseases is going to be the big deal. It is going to be the next flu. It is like, it's just a matter of time. And I just don't feel like we're ready for it. And you can tell I'm animated about it.
Keeps you up at night, and rightly so.
Okay, let me get off of my hobby horse there, and let's go to some. There's no segue for this. I'm just going to go completely to the next thing. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida told a press conference that he won't seek re-election, and he will instead step down after his Liberal Democratic Party selects a new leader next month. Kishida has had, I mean, terribly low approval ratings, even by US standards, for literally months. I mean, we're talking in the 20s and even below. So he hasn't been doing particularly well at all. There's a political funding corruption scandal that's been following him around. I think it's worth noting that, Kishida took power after Shinzo Abe was assassinated. I don't think Abe was actually prime minister at that time. Maybe he was. I forget exactly what the mechanics were. But I thought Kishida was going to have a little, this sounds a little grim now that I'm saying it, but like a honeymoon bounce off of the assassination, that everybody was going to rally around him and he was going to be able to push through lots of needed reforms and things like that when it came to that. And he fumbled it sort of right out of the gate. What do you make of him stepping down and what this means for Japanese geopolitics, John?
Yeah, well, I think the fundamental reason for him stepping down is mostly about internal politics and domestic politics. I think in his press conferences and speeches post his decision to not run, so he will step down. Well, basically, he will do what Biden has essentially done, which is he
Hmm.
will remain in position until his party chooses a new leader. I think sometime in the fall, I think is when that's due. So he's still in charge, but he just won't contest the next leadership contest. He said essentially that he's got low approval ratings. There's a ton of things that Japan needs to do to it's got an economy that's been just knocking along for I don't know 3 decades now, but they've been in malaise for a long time. I think there's a sense that society is in decline a little bit, not in the same way that maybe people feel like the US or Western liberalism is in decline, but quite literally a dying off population, and not a lot of innovation, just a stagnant country is I think the vibe that a lot of Japanese people have about their own country. And he and his party have been in charge for a long time. They have dominated post-war Japanese politics, and I think they are unable to deliver the kind of bold vision and solution for a Japan into 2030, 40, and 50 that Japanese folks want. And I think he's standing down. He said literally, "I'm standing down because I am clearly not able to make the decisions and bring my party along on some of the things the Japanese people are demanding." So, there's analogies I think between our society, Western societies, and a Japanese society that is kind of there's a sense of the future will not be better than the past has been. But also, I think this is my hobby horse. If yours is virus preparation, mine is that one party rule, no matter what side of politics you're on, no matter where it is, extended one party rule is terrible for the country. They can't. They get lazy. They get complacent. They entrench their graft and grift networks, which is another reason that his party's going through a scandal right now. Is there's been considerable corruption scandals that have plagued them over the last few years. And I'm in some ways knowing nothing about the different policy positions of the Japanese political parties. It might be a really good thing for the opposition party to become the leader of Japan, to get a mandate to change things, to shake things up, and see if they can't as I say, shake things up for a country that feels like, at least externally, I'm not Japanese and I don't talk to a ton of Japanese people regularly, but it seems like that's a country that just feels like it's, just almost in a zombie walk into the future.
Yeah, I'll take the other side of that trade, John. And over at my firm, we've taken the other side of that trade since before Warren
Yeah,
Buffett
I know
did
you
it.
have.
So,
Yeah.
like, we were early on. And I think you see some early signs that Japan is changing, whether it's remilitarization of Japan's quote unquote defense forces, whether it is
Mhm.
spending more on regional infrastructure than China is via the much more ballyhooed Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's, labor wages increasing or really starting programs to attract immigrants to come to Japan and set up shop there, whether that's Vietnamese manufacturing workers to digital nomads from the U.S. to set up shop in Japan. I think you're seeing some initial signs that Japan is turning. And one thing that Japanese history shows us is that Japan, as you said, it will kind of bounce around and not do anything. But when Japan changes, it changes fast and it changes big. So I would just keep an eye about, maybe Kishida, maybe it's nothing. Maybe this is just the continuing bumbling along, and we'll still be talking about this in a couple of years. But there are some interesting bubbles underneath the surface that to me say maybe Japan is starting to wake up. Maybe.
Yeah, you have more faith in the dynamism or the policies of Japanese people. I think it's a pretty staunchly traditional society. You're not going to see a ton of immigration anytime soon. But I would love to be wrong because it's one of my favorite places in the world, and I would love to see them, do well and break out. On to our final story this week. We're going to talk very briefly, I think, probably about the US election and, in particular, Iranian hacking of the campaign. So, yesterday, Donald Trump voted in the Florida primary, and afterwards, he held a little quick gaggle in which he said that, FBI has been investigating hacking claims into my campaign. I can't say anything about it except for the fact that it was Iran that did it. Kamala Harris's team has said the FBI notified them last month that her campaign had been targeted by a foreign actor influence operation through phishing emails and all this kind of stuff, widely assumed to be Iranian as well. Details are emerging, they always are, but Microsoft announced that Iranian-linked hackers had sent a spear phishing campaign in June to Trump and to Kamala Harris. So that's the link here, is that we can fairly safely assume that Iran is behind hacking of the campaigns. Now, I've said about 400 times that there are probably half a dozen countries with the capability and the intention to disrupt a US election. It's Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and maybe one or two others if they were in a bad mood or, didn't like a policy. But it's those big four and then a couple of others. Russia, North Korea, and Iran want to sow chaos, in my view, and China, would like to actually have some intelligence. They're probably doing it for more traditional intelligence collecting purposes. So I think the story here is that Iran has equally bipartisan hacking both parties, and I think that's important to note because both sides will probably try to exploit it for political purposes in the US, and it's very important that that message is out there so that people don't lose trust in the US election itself, which is of course the goal of these hackers. We might remember very briefly to the Russian hacking situation in 2016, which I think didn't do a whole lot to influence the outcome of the election, but did a whole lot to undermine people's trust in the outcome of the election. That's the dream scenario for these actors, right? And not for nothing, because I've got to get AI in there to juice the algorithm, Jacob. Apparently, these actors are all using OpenAI to help their hacking efforts. So a couple of questions for you that you can hit real quickly. What kinds of intellectual interference are even possible in your view between now and November? And also, do you take the other side of my trade that this cannot actually affect the outcome? Do you think it can affect the outcome?
Well, the first thing I want to say is if you weigh U.S. interference in Iran elections versus Iranian interference in U.S. elections over the past 70 to 80 years, guess what? The U.S. has interfered way more and with much, like literally with CIA plots and things like that.
They've got some ground to make
Iran.
up.
So, like, don't go and call me an Iran lover in the comments or anything like that. But like, if they're gonna do some cute little hacks around the margins, like I think they're entitled based on the long arc of U.S. Iranian history. I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite thinkers, Tony Judt, who was taken from us too soon as a result of ALS. He said back in 2000, roughly around 2007-8, that U.S. society is not going to be destroyed by the will to power of any leader or foreign power, but by the will to ignorance of its society. And I think that's what this is about. This is not about an external actor is going to make Americans lose faith in U.S. elections. It's that the U.S. citizens themselves are already losing faith and don't like each other. I read an interesting Carnegie paper recently that talked about how the U.S. electorate is undergoing this thing that they called affective polarization, which is if you look at the actual big ticket issues like gay marriage, gun control, access to reproductive health care, things like that. Most Americans, like 60, 70%, are basically on the same side.
Mm-hmm.
There are some disagreements about when and in what cases and what, but generally speaking, Americans agree on a lot of these big things. Immigration reform, another big one. The problem is that Americans also trust each other less than they ever did before. They don't like each other. And politicians are playing on those visceral emotional feelings and stoking fear and using populism to ensconce themselves in the halls of power. And they know that if they push on those fear buttons, on those hate buttons, on those dislike buttons, they get even more. And the situation goes. Just look at the way that J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, for example, are talking past each other on the campaign trail, or the way that the discourse between Kamala and Donald Trump is happening. You can feel the visceral dislike, even though their policies probably wouldn't be that different. So Iran can hack whatever they want. Godspeed to them. They're not going to affect anything. It goes back to what Lincoln said a long time ago. A house divided amongst itself can't stand. And if Americans continue to dislike, distrust, and just generally not like each other, then the legitimacy of elections is going to be called into questions. Iran can push that, a little bit, but they're taking advantage of something that's happening. They're not creating some kind of problem.
Yeah, I agree. And what you're referring to there are what I think political apparatchiks call wedge issues, which I think I prefer your taxonomy of hate buttons far more accurately. It calls a spade. So we should stop using those kind of sanitized ways of making politicians seem less craven than they often are. All right. On that awful note, let's move on to a palate cleansing game, Jacob, of over under. We take this from our favorite sports shows where we'll ask each other to take one side or the other of a bet and briefly explain why. You're up first in the hot seat. So I'm going to say over under 5 days until Iran retaliates against Israel for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh a couple of weeks ago.
So if you had asked me this last week, I would have said under and I would have been wrong. So I'm not exactly sure what Iran is waiting for here. And that's why I think I'm going to take the over. I think maybe Iran is hoping to really maximize the level of surprise with their attack. And maybe they have other domestic issues or things that we're not able to see that are happening that are stopping them. But if they haven't done it until now, I think logic probably dictates that you go over and that you hit Israel when it's least expecting it and at a time of maximum pain.
It's a pretty good take, I think.
Yeah, pretty good. Maybe I should do this for a living. I don't know. So, John, I'll ask you, over under 10 years until China invades Taiwan.
It's a hard one. You've got two different forces. I'm going to take the over for the simple reason that I don't think it's easy, and I don't think the Chinese military is able to do it effectively yet. You've got two big dates. You've got Xi Jinping's kind of end of life. I mean, the guy's old. He's in his early 70s now and probably doesn't have a whole lot of time left as leader of China. He wants to be the person who reunites it. He sees Mao, Deng, then him as like the natural progression of brilliant, amazing Chinese leaders. He would like to do it on his watch, but they must do it before 2049, which is the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the PRC. So I'm going to take the over. I'm going to say it's going to happen before 2049, but longer than 10 years, just purely because I think militarily they won't want to take a massive L either, and it won't be easy.
Makes sense.
Fantastic. All right, folks. Thanks so much for joining us again for another episode of Jacob and John and Jacob. I can't remember whose name goes first, but either way, you're here and we appreciate it. Thanks, Jacob.
Cheers.